love my channel and would like to show your support, please click on the link below this video and become the patron of the Ushanka Show. For as little as $1, you can help us grow and create the new, interesting videos about the life in Soviet Union. Hello comrades and welcome back to the Ushanka Show. Today we'll talk about Soviet Airlines, company called Aeroflot, which used to be the largest air company in the world, with approximately 600,000 people working for it and flying approximately 10,000 aircraft or so. But before we start talking about Aeroflot, I would like to mention a couple of funny things about Soviet railroads. If you watch my previous video, I discussed the different types of Soviet train cars, and one of them was Platzkart. It was better than general car, общий вагон, but worse than coupe. And what I learned when I became a tall person, well, now I'm about 6 foot 2 inches, that if I get a place in Platzkart, in the better one, not the side place, because there you kind of sleep parallel with the hallway, but in the better location you sleep kind of like 90 degrees to the train and to the car, I figure out that I need to take the top shelf, top bunk. So when you buy a ticket on a train, you don't really have a choice. They just give you what's available or whatever's next ticket number. Then when you get on the train, you can try to trade your spots. Some people didn't feel comfortable sleeping on the top bunk because there was really no guards to prevent you from falling off. So older people or parents with kids would prefer to stay in the bottom bunks. So I will always try to trade for the top bunk. And the reason is this. You see, when I became a tall kid and slept once when we were traveling on a train on the bottom bunk, it made my feet stick out to the hole where everyone walks. So when you sleep and people still using the bathroom in the middle of the night, so they would walk through the train car in a semi-darkness, not seeing much, and they always will bump in your feet and this will wake you up. Now if you take the top bunk, your feet will still stick out, but they will be sticking out on an eye level, so the person will see it and dodge it and they won't wake you up. So that's the reason why I always try to trade my spot and take the top bunk so I can still sleep with my feet sticking out into the walking area, and I won't be bothered because people will see my feet sticking out and they will dodge it and I'll have a good night's sleep on a train. And now we're going back to Aeroflot story. As I mentioned earlier, Aeroflot for a long time was the biggest air company in the world. And it sounded like, wow, it's so impressive. It's a really great achievement of the Soviet economy. But to think about it, it was the only company in the biggest country in the world. So it had to be huge. And I wonder, I couldn't find any information, if anyone knows, to compare the combined traffic, like amount of airplanes and amount of people, like passengers in the United States and maybe in the 1980s, early 80s, comparing what Aeroflot did, and to see how the whole country airlines of the United States and the single airline in Soviet Union, how they compare together. But if you take like by separate airlines, Aeroflot was the biggest airline in the world for a long time till 1991 when Soviet Union collapsed. Then Aeroflot was split in several companies and became like number 17 or something. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to fly Aeroflot during the Soviet Union. The very first time when I flew Aeroflot out of Moscow to New York was in the summer of 1995, and that's when the very first time I arrived to America on exchange program. And I'll talk about my story later in my videos. My father flew once for work from Kiev to Volgograd, Russia, and back. But what I remember as a kid about Aeroflot is those silly banners installed in Kiev and probably Moscow. It was a big, large signs on the highway, and what they say would be a picture of the smiling flight attendant lady, and it says, "Please fly Aeroflot. Летайте самолетами Аэрофлота." And that was kind of ironic because it was the only air company in Soviet Union, so this whole advertising telling you, hey, you need to fly Aeroflot, to be like, hey, you need to breathe air, because, well, you had no other option anyway. So that's what I remember about Aeroflot as a kid, that interesting posters advertising Aeroflot as the only company we had in Soviet Union. So Aeroflot was the biggest airline in the world, operating in the biggest country in the world. Soviet Union was the biggest country, and even now Russia is the biggest country in the world, even after missing 14 Soviet republics. And Russia is so huge, Soviet Union was so huge that if you fly from Moscow to New York, it's pretty much the same distance and time as flying from Moscow to the opposite side of Soviet Union or Russia, like Khabarovsk. It takes, I believe, 7 hours from Moscow to New York, and it was 8 hours from Moscow to Khabarovsk. So it's a huge country, huge distances. The cost of flying was pretty high. The flight that I mentioned from Moscow to Khabarovsk, 8 hours, the ticket was 125 rubles, which is approximately a monthly salary, average salary in Soviet Union. So that's a lot of money. It's you fly in one way. So to fly there and back, you have to pay 2 monthly salaries. So for example, it would be like you fly from New York to Moscow and back for about $4,000. So that was pretty expensive. So not many people really can afford it. Now, of course, people who worked in Siberia, they were getting paid way more than people working in the European part of Soviet Union. There was a policy in Soviet Union to develop Siberia, so they will pay premium to people who moved to Siberia to work on different projects, and many people stayed there, and so they always had a lot of money and they could afford to fly Aeroflot. The other people will be like taxi drivers. They were making a lot of money in Soviet Union, and the waitresses or waiters, the guys, they were also one of these category of workers that could make a lot of money, way more than engineers or scientists, and we'll talk about it later in a different video. So those people could afford fly Aeroflot. The interesting detail about flying Aeroflot inside of the Soviet Union on a long distance, you get a meal, but it was always exactly the same thing. It was a chicken and rice, and it was called Aeroflot style chicken. There was a lot of jokes about it. For example, like which chicken flies higher than anything else, and it's Aeroflot chicken. So there was a chicken a la Aeroflot, and it wasn't good. A lot of people complained about it. Unfortunately, I said when I flew Aeroflot in 1995, I flew on Boeing, on American airplane, and the food was already to Western standards. Another interesting detail about flying Aeroflot inside of Soviet Union, that was strictly forbidden to take photos or video during the flight out of the windows. And it's kind of silly because at that time there was already spy satellites taking photos all over Soviet Union, but it was strictly forbidden to take any pictures while you're flying Aeroflot. So Moscow, of course, the capital of Soviet Union, capital of Russia, was the biggest city in Soviet Union and had the most air traffic and the most amount of airports. There were about 100 cities that you could fly from Moscow, but the problem was that connected flights didn't exist. So you have to fly, for example, and then sit and wait to another flight. And another problem was that different airports in Moscow, they were covering different areas, different directions. So for example, Domodedovo airport will be flights mostly going to Siberia and far Middle East. Vnukovo airport would be covering southern direction like Crimea and southern Russia and Ukraine, Moldova. Sheremetyevo airport, there'll be international flights and also northwestern direction. So if, for example, if you arrive from Far East to Domodedovo, you couldn't fly out of that airport if you need to go, for example, to Crimea. So you had to take a taxi or public transportation and get from one airport to another airport, and then you wait for the flight, maybe even have to stay overnight, then you grab another flight. So inside of the Soviet Union, Aeroflot wasn't exactly like the most comfortable, enjoyable flights, but it was a pretty reliable company. And considering its size and amount of people flew every year, since 1953 there was only 127 flight accidents and about 7,000 people died as a result of those. One of the worst Aeroflot accident happened on August 11, 1979, when two Soviet airliners Tu-134 Tu-134 collided above Ukraine, and of course everyone died on both planes. 178 people died, and among the people on those planes were the soccer team Pakhtakor from Uzbekistan, and that's one of the reasons why that air crash became so, I won't say famous, but known, because the whole team just got wiped out and they couldn't play for a long time in a soccer championship in Soviet Union because the whole team disappeared. That happened in 1979. Just like situation on Soviet trains, that domestic trains were way worse quality wise, like there was older train cars and not as good service. Same was happening in Aeroflot. International flights were like 1,000 times better, had a better food, better service, more comfortable seats. And Aeroflot was flying all over the world. They had one of the best narrow body long range jet planes like IL-62, which they flew to Havana and Cuba and many other countries. Now I want to go really quickly over several famous Soviet airplanes and airliners that Aeroflot was using. Of course, if you're interested, you can always Google it, and there's a lot of information about those on Wikipedia. But first airplane, it's a famous Soviet Kukuruznik AN-2, which is actually in the Guinness World Book of Records because that's the only airplane that was manufactured for over 60 years. It started to being made in 1947, and they stopped manufacturing them in Soviet Union in 1971, the year I was born, but they were still making them in Poland and China, and there was over 18,000 airplanes made. And the nickname of that airplane was, as I mentioned, Kukuruznik, which is funny thing because it's the same nickname as a Nikita Khrushchev got, Kukuruznik, because kukuruza is the word for corn. And since Khrushchev was such a big fan of introducing corn into Soviet agriculture, he got nicknamed Kukuruznik. And this airplane was used a lot for spraying crops, and as well as kukuruza, so it was its nickname, Kukuruznik. They had a lot of different versions of this airplane. It was a 10-passenger version, and as I said, as a crop sprayer and many other functions. This was a really versatile, reliable plane and was, as I said, manufactured for over 60 years. Next famous plane is IL-62 and IL-62M, Il-62. It was manufactured also for a long time from 1966 to 1995. It was the first Soviet narrow-body long-range jet plane, which was covering flights to the far east in Siberia as well as international flights. Another interesting airplane is Tu-114 Tu-114. That was a turboprop, long-range passenger plane, which was conveniently based on existing Tu-95 strategic bomber. So that plane was one of the fastest turboprop passenger planes ever built, but of course because it was a modified strategic bomber. Then was another airplane, Tu-104, which was medium-range narrow-body turbojet, and it was also based on strategic bomber Tu-16 Badger. So you see, that was really convenient. First of all, there'll be airplane developed for the military, then they will modify it and make a passenger version. So that will save a lot of money and time developing airplanes. And here's pictures of other airplanes that Aeroflot was using. Il-18 turboprop plane, Tu-124, Tu-134, Yak-40, which was the world's first commuter trijet. It had 3 engines. IL-86, AN-24, which was manufactured for over 20 years, was a very noisy but very reliable, safe airplane, and it was made in Kiev, Ukraine. Actually, I worked at that airplane facility for about 6 months in 1990s. Then another one from same factory, same designer, Antonov 26, AN-26, AN-10. So those were also airplanes that were used extensively by Aeroflot. So there's my story about Soviet Aeroflot. I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you very much. Goodbye.